All right, the first album not named after a color, and after much discourse within the fan base and community, I could say that stone isn't necessarily a color, but it is a gradient. So it's a little bit of a pivot, right? I know that some people are like, no, 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 stone's a color. And I'm like, well, stone's more of a gradient because you can have a lot of different colors of stone, even though that's more of gray. Anyway, we're getting lost in the weeds. Let's dive into it. Stone by Baroness. So, Baroness is an American sludge metal band that I really fell in love with back in the mid 2010s, with their kind of 1-2 punch of the green and yellow album and the purple album. Like, those two records for me are just stand out. Their last album of Gold and Gray left me a little bit cold. There's a little bit of a changeover within the personnel that we have here as well. It's been pretty consistent with John Baisley on lead vocals, rhythm guitars, keyboard, percussion. And he's kind of been like the main focal point of this band. He's been the main driving force. And helping him out, we have Nick Jose on bass keyboards and additional backing vocals, Sebastian Thomas on drums, and the newest member of Gina Gleason on lead vocals, backing vocals. Yeah, I wasn't too excited about Gold and Gray. And even now, just because of the length of the album, I don't really return to it quite as much as pretty much any other albums from them. Like the Blue and Red album, I feel like are of a camp of their own. For me, it wasn't until like the Green and Yellow album and the Purple album that was really like the highlight. That was the stuff that I love. Now, I still go back to Blue and Red quite regularly, but like when I look into my heart, the Purple and the Green and Yellow albums, that's my love. That's my love. So I don't want to say hesitant about jumping into this album, but I was cautiously optimistic. They've had an album cycle now under their belt with this new lineup. This is a pretty consistent lineup at this point, and I was ready for them to also move on with the whole color sequence that they were doing. And this was kind of like a notable thing for them, that this is them entering a new phase of the same band, kind of like entering a new chapter. And so there's a little bit of carryover that we had from the Gold and Gray album, but they're also trying new things in this one. And some things work and some things I'm less than excited about. Let's talk about the things I love about this album first. The first is the production. They don't sound like they're playing through mud, which is a really big A+ for me. Because the only thing that I would say about the Purple album that I still have a kind of a little bit of a rough time with is that it just sounds so muddy. It sounds so bleh. And I know that's part of the whole sludge metal aesthetic. At the same time, guys, come on. I want to be able to hear what's on the album. I don't want to hear as if anything is like everything is being played like this the whole time, so I can't hear whatever is actually going through with it. So, yeah, I'm glad to hear that they actually have somebody, I don't want to say competent, because that's not quite the right word, but at least somebody that knows how to structure the mixing of an album so that each individual instrument can be heard. The guitar tuning is still that sludgy, still that like gnarly sound, and I'm okay with it because I can actually hear it. I can hear it very distinctly from the drums, I can hear it very distinctly from the vocals. The other highlight that I love about this album is the amount of harmonizations that we have on here. John and Gina do a brilliant work harmonizing with one another, and you can hear that very, very distinctly with their opening and closing tracks of Ember and Bloom. Embers opens up with a very soft and very somber moment, very similar to how Watershed opened up with Opeth, where it's just this very somber, very like vocal-oriented track. Lots of beautiful harmonies in that sense. And Bloom takes that and then expands on it. We take that minute-long track and expand into about the 4-minute length. And I really appreciate them bookmarking this album with this really haunting and very beautiful passage. The tracks in between, this is where the album begins to fall a little bit short for me, because unlike past albums where there were a couple of tracks here and there that I was really able to latch onto, This one, it's a little bit harder to have those moments that I get excited for. Last Words and Beneath the Rose do a good job of opening up this album. There's a couple of tracks on here, especially like Chorus, where they're trying some really interesting things, especially with more of like a spoken word aspect and not harmonizing the vocal works with the rest of the track around it. It's very like Bob Dylan in that sense, and I'm not a big fan of that kind of presentation of music where it grates on me. And at least within Choir, they come back into it within the chorus work, so I'm okay with that. But I just feel like after that, with some of these other tracks like The Dirge, Andanine, Shine, they're here and then they're gone. They don't have that big build up, that big payoff. They just kind of are at this one baseline and they never really move. You don't have, as I mentioned on some of my past reviews, like these peaks and valleys. There's no range within a lot of these tracks. They're very, I don't want to say monosyllabic in that sense, but I guess Stone is a very good moniker for this album because it's very samey. Like there's very little variations between the tracks, which makes for a very samey listen without very much things for me to kind of hang on to. Luckily this album is a little bit on the shorter side at under 50 minutes. I think it's 46 minutes. And I appreciate that length of this album because since we don't have that variation, I find my mind beginning to wander quite heavily on this album without too much perch. And I wish that there was something to draw me back into this album like we had with tracks like Chlorine and Wine within the Purple album and many of the instrumental tracks that we had from the Yellow and Green passage. But this just kind of feels like a transitional album with really no clear direction of where they're going to go from here. And I do wish that, the next album takes what they learned from this, because there are moments on this album that I really enjoy. The harmonizations, the layering of the music, the layering of the instruments on here. There's a lot of really meaty and beautiful guitar works on here. I'm loving the soundscapes that they're placing down on this. But they don't have that quite clear crystal vision of where to go. Like a lot of these tracks are just kind of wandering the landscape without a real destination of where is this track going to go? How is it going to develop? How is it going to crescendo? How is it going to come together? What was the point? Was something that I kept wondering as I was listening to Stone. But sometimes the point is just to exist. And in that case, it was fine. And these are always the albums that I find the hardest to review because at the end of the day, it's fine. I think it's a step above Golden Gray because I don't feel like it's a big slog to get through, but I also feel as if, I don't know, they're wandering the landscape without a clear direction, much like this review. So I think on that note, I'm going to bring this album review to a close, summarize it up a little bit. Stone was a very interesting album for Baroness. As I mentioned, it starts a new chapter for them, and I honestly will say that I am excited to see where they're going to go from here, especially outside of this whole color spectrum thing that they were doing. I'm glad that it sounds good. I think it's the best sounding album that they've had. I just wish that the music that was on it was a little bit more to celebrate, So it's for that reason that I'll say Stone from Baroness is one I would ultimately stream. This is an interesting one. I can see it being a little bit more divisive within the fan base. Like this album doesn't necessarily have the teeth that some of the past tracks had, but I can also see some fans being a little frustrated with it as well, as I was. But yeah, I think that's where I'm going to stop. I think that's where I'm good at. What did you guys think of Stone from Baroness? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And yeah, that's all I got. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.